Okay, welcome to Merry Musing 6, this one on the universal Trinity, which is a piece of the evolution theory that I worked on for my PhD, but really a kind of core underlying piece of how it all seems to work. And during the research, when I was at some of the events that Ubiquity University hosted, particularly at Chartres, listening to different speakers talking about the different spiritual and religious traditions, this pattern jumped out at me of these traditions that seemed to fit this idea of the torus that came out in evolution theory, and seemed to be that they were kind of all describing the same thing, but from their different cultural and historical perspectives. So I dug into that a lot deeper and did indeed find patterns that I think make a good case for saying that all of these different traditions are essentially describing the process of life coming into manifestation and the context for that. So we're going to dive into that with the Universal Trinity session today. So what I want to start with is just a description of how I framed the thesis for the Universal Trinity in Volution. So as we look out at the world, we can see for every entity at every level. The argument within Volution is that we are in a fractal holographic universe, which means the same patterns come back at every level. And so an entity is essentially anything with a boundary defined and a name. So for every entity at every level, we see these same basic dynamics. We see what I call the boundary field, or a unified field, that is created by the original impulse for the entity that transcends yet includes every part of the entity, which is, of course, an entity in its own right. It's the principle of the holon, a holon being a part and a whole. And so every holon, every entity has this boundary field to it. And that's created out of the tension field between the present and the future possibility or need, like in an ecology, where there's a niche and something is needing to be born to fill that niche. That creates this information field that has on it the description of exactly what it is that is needed to be able to fill that niche. So the boundary field. And then there is an aspect of an entity that we can perceive with our five senses, so which are called relative manifestations, so the thing that we see. And then the third aspect is what goes on between those two. So you've got this unified field of potential where the information is that describes the purpose of that entity, essentially, to be able to fill the niche. And then you've got it manifesting. And then you've got the process that goes on in between that whole, that unified field, that purpose, and the actual manifestation. And that's what I've called ubiquitous spirit. So the unified field, and this is an important point that I came across as I was looking into it, the unified field is different to what one might call absolute oneness or God. And this is a subtle distinction, but in that the unified field is something we perceive with our understanding because we can describe it. We're describing it as the field of an entity out there. And as such is always a relative part of a bigger whole, right? It's in the holon, holarchy of parts and wholes. Whereas absolute oneness is our inner subjective experience of oneness. that ultimately one can't describe, that people attempt to with poetry and art. You can't describe through the rational mind, because the rational mind strength is to be able to distinguish and divide between things. And yet here we're talking about an experience of unity. So that's why if you look in the image on the right, from the Christian tradition, they talk about you've got Father, Son, and Spirit, Holy Spirit, but that Father isn't the same as God. So God is the oneness that can't be divided. So in that sense, what we're really looking at here in the Trinity is the Father, Son, Spirit, or the unified field, relative manifestation, and ubiquitous spirit, because we are talking about the process of manifestation, and the absolute oneness has nothing to do with manifestation. It just is. So one point on that, one quote on that before we move on. This is the images from Alex Gray's Sacred Mirrors. He's called it The Void. And here is an attempt to describe that absolute oneness from the Tilopa, the song of the Mahamudra. Though words are spoken to explain the void as such can never be expressed. Though we say the mind is a bright light, it is beyond all words and symbols. Although the mind is void in essence, all things it embraces and contains. So that's all we're going to say, or attempt to say, about the absolute oneness, because you can't really describe it by definition. But it is important to remember that distinction between the Trinity, which by definition we have already divided into three. We've divided the oneness into three with the Trinity. So it's not the same as the oneness. And an acknowledgement that we have this absolute oneness. And often the confusion is made between absolute oneness or Father and, absolute oneness or God and Father. So the way that I've seen these dynamics playing out in terms of a form is in this form of the torus, where you've got a creative tension between a seed in the present and a potential in the future. And it's through that tension, as I was describing earlier, that you get this unified field or surface brain emerge that holds all the information of the possibilities that this entity can become in manifestation. So this is a simple kind of 2D flattened out, in a way, description of those elements. So the Trinity here is the container, which is the unified field, the manifest, and the dynamics or the ubiquitous spirit that go on in between. So in the torus, you've got the skin, the brain of the torus, the container. You've got the manifest world at the 90-degree plane, and you've got the dynamics and the flow and everything that goes on as all that information interacts with these different levels of more gross or subtle reality, held in this creative tension between the seed and the potential in terms of the niche in the ecology. So a need that is identified between, so in the present, a need identified that creates the possibility for the future. That is what brings this whole thing into motion, into volution, into spin, which creates this container, and then this whole thing starts off, this whole process. So there's the overlay of the torus on these elements. Actually pretty beautiful how I noticed this for the first time when if you zoom into the heart chakra symbol now, and it's right at the center of the galaxy, how it's lit up there. Nice one. So you've got this tension between the seed and the potential, the current situation and the niche that is requiring, has the possibility to be filled. And that then is what brings things into manifestation in this process. So it creates the container. The container, for example, I'm going to go into this more detail later. Examples in the traditions are the Black Madonna, the Absolute, the One, the Unified Field, it's called. Remembering the distinction between this and absolute oneness or God. And this can be described as the soul, this container, this brain of the entity, because it's where all of the information is held that contains the possibility and potentiality of this being, of this entity to become something. And when you are that entity yourself, it's like being the fish in water in terms of your relationship to the soul. So you can't ever see that container, but your experience of it is that experience of absolute oneness. But again, that's an inner experience. And then you've got the manifest. So you've got the one as the container, the many as the manifest. In the Christian tradition, in the Christ-Mary relationship. And then the dynamics is what goes on in between. So the spirit, Shekinah, the subtle energies. So from a Wilberian perspective, you could talk about the container being the causal, dynamics being the subtle, and the manifest being the gross. So these three key aspects. Anne Baring has a lovely description of this process. She says this cosmic information template, so that's the container, right? The cosmic information template holds within it the design of the process of expansion and development of the universe. So all of the information, so the universe is an entity like this as well, that has these three aspects to it. So that template holds the information on its expansion and development. Yet it also facilitates the emergence of all kinds of possibilities as it expands. So all the possibilities are the things that emerge in the manifest. And that emergence process is what goes on in the subtle dynamics. And held, another way of framing the polarity in the poles between Sacred Mother and Sacred Father, because Sacred Mother is often referred to as that which fully accepts you for who you are, the Sacred Mother, and the Sacred Father that fully loves you for all you could become. And there we are, born in between this who we are and our potential. So to go into each of the elements a little bit more and touch on some other descriptions and some examples from other traditions. So the entity whose container it is, right? This is what I said before, is like a fish in water. You can't see or talk about it objectively because you're immersed in it. Art and poetry attempt to share our sense of it. So as Rumi says, you who know Jalaluddin, you the one in all, say who I am, say I am you. So that logical mind can't grok that, but it's that feeling of complete identification with, immersion in. But of course, from a more objective perspective, we can talk about something as having a container like this or a soul, right? And that's why we talk about, in, say, the Christian tradition, the Father. And many different names have come up from the kind of more scientific side where they tend to talk about fields more. So Erwin Laszlo's work with the Akashic field, Rupert Sheldrake and the morphogenetic field, more generically information fields, unified fields, all things, fields that hold information. Or David Bohm's implicate order. So it's not yet explicate because it's not unfolded yet. It exists as a possibility or as potential, as information held on this brain, B-R-A-N-E, of the entity. It's the unmanifested Godhead. So the manifest, probably the world, that we're most familiar with. The Vesica Pisces and the geometry that you can see below is often used to describe this process where you've got the two interface in the Vesica Pisces to create the third dimension into which things manifest. So again, another way of thinking about it is between the poles, the polarities of the two emerges the third dimension. So it's matter, the many nodes in the web, places where the energy and information congeals or comes together. And for Bohme, this is the explicate order. So there's order both in the information, in the implicate, and in the explicate. One is visible to our senses, as it were, and the other is hidden to our normal senses. And then you've got the dynamic, so that which goes on in the interface between the unified field and the manifest reality, where the energy is flowing. So information is carried on waves that we describe as energy. So energy is really information in motion as it comes from the causal field into the subtle and becomes increasingly dense until, if the conditions are right, it manifests in the gross realm. And so many different terms for that. Energy, prana, dark energy, spirit, etc., the subtle. And David Abraham describes, he does great work describing these kind of perspectives, and this is his how he describes the Hopi perspective on things. The manifested, so that's what we just looked at before this one, is that aspect of phenomena already evident to our senses, while the manifesting is that which is not yet explicit, not yet present to the senses, but which is assumed to be, and he uses the word psychologically, gathering itself toward the manifestation within the depths of all sensible phenomena. So it's assumed to be psychologically gathering itself toward the manifestation within the depths of all sensible phenomena. So it's emerging, coming together out of the, some people would call it the dimension of mind or the subtle dimensions, in formation, coming towards formation into the manifest. So this is just a screenshot of from the thesis, where there's various different traditions and references to people who have kind of described these dynamics in these three different areas. So you can find more on that in the Volution Theory.net site under the Trinity heading. So here's just a couple of other examples of traditions that bring them together. The Tao begat one, one begat two, two begat three, and three begat 10,000 things. The 10,000 things carry yin and embrace yang. They achieve harmony by combining these forces. So there again, you've got the Trinity and you've got the polarity. So the container, this is from Anne Baring's work. The Tao is the fathomless source. The manifest, they would call the Te, where you've got organic growth, and the dynamics, the Qing, or the creative intelligence. So there it is in the Tao Te Ching, right? In one phrase there, you've got these three, this basic description of the process of life, from oneness into the many. From the Enneads by Plotinus, this then is how the material thing becomes beautiful, by communicating in the thought, reason, logos, that flows from the divine. And so he's going the other way here, right? How the material things become beautiful. The divine, he references here, is the container. The manifest is what he calls the material thing. And then the dynamics, thought, reason, or logos. And it's the fact that the material thing is informed by the reason or logos that gives it its beauty, because there's a natural design, one could say, like in the geometry, the sacred geometry, right? Those patterns are inherent in the dynamics, in the subtle fields, and when we're aligned with them and we don't get in the way, then they give form to beauty. And you know, lots of research being done that people, when they see things that are consistent with the sacred geometric dimensions and proportions, that they naturally see them as more beautiful than things that aren't reflecting those proportions. That was Plotinus. And then Walter Russell, who's done obviously really great work in this area, Binder created a description of his work where he referenced Russell talking about three basic types of words. One, he described, so one type of word is called one, words that express the concept of unity, wholeness, absolutes, and absence of division into parts. So that's clearly our container. Words that express relationship, so words that express the dividing or the connecting lines that relate apparently separate parts to each other. So not the separate parts, but the relationships between the parts. And that's what exists in the field between the parts. In the dynamics is where the relationship is more primary than the part itself. And then what he calls the many as a type of word, words that express the concept of individuality, diversity, and the presence of opposition. So there again, you've got that basic Trinity pattern. This is from a more recent piece of work, the Kondratiev waves. I don't know if you're familiar with those, but they are like the cycles of the economy, how they predicted that what's going to drive the economy. And Nevyedov has created this concept called the six Kondratiev, which is the predictions around what the next economic wave will be driven by. That is essentially around holistic social and individual health and well-being. And in that book, he describes it in this way. Information stands for the immaterial field of reality. Matter is a manifestation of energy. Matter and energy result from immaterial information fields and are an actualization of information. Information is thus the most fundamental principle of existence. Neither matter nor energy can exist without information, but information can exist without matter or energy. So if you look at it in this way, he's saying the container can be there without the dynamics or the manifest, right? The container holds the potential, the information. But until it actually comes into movement, into volution, then the energy and the dynamics and the manifest matter aren't there yet. So I thought this was a really clear description of things from that kind of more science language perspective, let's say. So to summarize it again, to go back to that description at the beginning, circle back around, looking out at the world, we can see for every entity at every level a boundary field created by the original impulse for the entity that transcends yet includes every part of the entity. So a holon created through that tension for the niche in the ecology. An aspect of an entity we can perceive with our five senses, the relative manifestation, and an aspect of reality that exists in between the two, the ubiquitous spirit. And that the thesis being that this is essentially what seemingly nearly all of the traditions, I haven't found an exception yet, have described in their Trinitarian systems, where they're basically pointing to this fundamental dynamic in the manifestation process that would reflect the Volution thesis. And a reminder that for all of this playing with concepts and words and separation, we have to remember that it's different to the absolute oneness, which is the inner subjective experience of it, as opposed to talking about the unifying field as an objective something outside of ourselves, which is also valid, but important to distinguish between those two. So there's some musings on the Trinity. So we got plenty of time now to dive into that any more with any questions, comments, reflections that people have. You can find more on the Volution Theory website or on my own website, and the other musings that are related to this on the Ubiquity University site.